Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C. Our first item of business today is to extend our warmest congratulations to the Russian Federation and to the Russian people on the return of Crimea to the Russian fold. The repatriation of Crimea is now an accomplished fact, and we need statesmen who are realists, and today no realist could imagine that that arrangement will be changed in anybody's lifetime who is now on this planet. And that, of course, comes after an exemplary referendum. If 82% of the people vote and 97% are in favor of Russia, that looks like a pretty clear verdict, and we are not in favor of secessionism on this program, and we would warn against trying to use this as the occasion to revive secessionism in the world or in the United States, God forbid. Rather, we could see this as a kind of guided process. Certainly, the mobilization of Russian forces over the past 2 weeks, I would stress again, that was essential to prevent a civil war in Ukraine. If the Russian military had not mobilized, had not taken over Ukraine and gone to the border between Russia and Ukraine on land, that probably would have left the Russians of Ukraine with the feeling that they had to rise up and defend themselves with military operations of their own, and that would then have led to a civil war. So it's important to see this as the successful dodging of a civil war. But the main point is Russia started in Ukraine, right? It is the Kiev Rus, where in the year 988, Duke Vladimir embraced the Orthodox faith, and everything in Russian history starts with that, as Putin says. Kiev is the mother of all Russian cities, no doubt about it. So at least the Crimean part has now been repatriated. We'll talk later in the program about what is likely to come in the immediate framework. But let's just get the policy guidelines clearly stated at the beginning. What Ukraine needs, first of all, is neutralization. You can call it Finlandization. That term acquired a kind of negative connotation during the Cold War. But Finlandization is a perfectly reasonable and respectable status for the neighbor of a great power to be in, especially after this area, Ukraine, had served as the avenue for invasion on so many occasions, from Napoleon to Hitler. So neutralization is also what the Ukrainians decided for themselves in a moment of lucidity back in 2010. I guess this was about the same time that Yanukovych was elected to his second term in office, I guess, or however you want to count it. But in 2010, the neutrality of Ukraine became a matter of law, and means, above all, do not join NATO, and I would add, do not join the European Union at this time. The European Union it functions, unfortunately, as the economic arm of NATO. And for countries that are already in it, I propose fight within it to transform it from within. But if you're not in it, and especially under these special circumstances of Ukraine, it's not time to join the European Union. We find that today the fascist Yatsenyuk has gone to Brussels, where he has cavorted with Prime Minister Cameron of Britain, the Portuguese fascist Barroso, the unfortunate specimen Van Rompuy, known in France as a broken man. If he's rompu, he's a broken man for sure. This poor squirrely guy came out, and actually there is a kind of resemblance between Rompuy and Yatsenyuk. Have to look into that. But some threats issued there by Van Rompuy, a British puppet But Yatsenyuk has now signed the association agreement of Ukraine with the European Union. And that, of course, means Yatsenyuk has signed his own political death warrant with that, because those killer conditions of austerity, which I guess are going to be made public after the May election, right? The poor Ukrainians are going to be denied the real content of the Fatherland Party and the Svoboda Party and the right sector until they've already elected a figurehead president who will then come in and serve as the proconsul of the Troika of the International Monetary Fund. And there are clauses in the EU association agreement, which Yatsenyuk correctly rejected back in November. There are clauses in the EU association agreement which pledge the signatory, Ukraine, to do nothing to contradict the policies of NATO. So this is a kind of an antechamber to NATO, and that is very, very dangerous. And the position of the United States must be that Ukraine is not desired as a member of NATO, should not join NATO, not now, not ever. There's no reason for this. Who in his right mind wants to be pledged to fight and die for a bunch of Ukrainian fascists in Kiev? You want to go and fight and die for Chanibok, for Yarosh? You want to go and fight for this Pirubi or any of the others, right? These other Nazis, fascists, anti-Semites, reactionaries, union busters. You don't want to be committed to defend any such thing. So the first plank of our policy is the neutralization or Finlandization of the country. No membership in NATO, no membership in the European Union. But then, of course, quite possible to have profitable relations with both the Russian-led customs union and the European Union and others. It's a big world. So that would be the first question. And then for the internal arrangements, as any number of commentators have pointed out, the problem inherent in Ukraine is you've got these two large groups. You've got the Ukrainian-speaking Greek Catholic, primarily groups in the West, especially the Lvov or Lemberg groups, and then you've got the Eastern Ukraine with the Russian speakers, and they are of Orthodox faith. And it takes a moderate policy to be able to maintain the interests of both. Therefore, though some have talked about federalism for Ukraine, it seems to me this is one of those rare cases where a confederal solution should be instituted. That is to say, the Ukrainian Confederation. You can think of it as something like the dual monarchy, right? In the case of Austria-Hungary, there were two states there, really, with the same foreign policy and the same defense policy. But in the case of Ukraine, it could be the Western Ukraine and the Eastern Ukraine, right? The western part, the Galicia, and the eastern part, the Donetsk, Donbass area, and therefore a confederation. Now imagine, let's think of, do we have any successful examples of neutral confederations in Europe which are also multi-ethnic, multinational states? Look at Ukraine, of course, multinational. Got Russians, got Ukrainians, you've got some Hungarians, you've got some Slovaks, you've got all sorts of people. And some of those languages, Hungarian had a limited validity as an official language under the previous legislation. Well, lo and behold, it's Switzerland. Switzerland, the Confederatio Helvetica, is a great example of a highly successful, neutral, confederal state. So why not think about imitating the Swiss model? Could do much worse. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. And welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So the call goes out from here. Let Ukraine be a neutral country. Let it be Finlandized, if you must put it that way. Neutral and a confederation with probably two principal parts, although that's up to the ethnic groups involved. There might be other subdivisions of this confederal state. And the good example of a country which has been It's multi-ethnic. It's got French. It's got Italians. It's got Germans, Rhaeto-Romanish in the Graubünden or Grison area, and that's Switzerland, neutral and confederal, Confederatio Helvetica. That's what it means. The Swiss Confederation. That's the official name of the country. The country we know as Switzerland actually has that Latin name. That works fine. Why wouldn't that work for Ukraine? And you might say, well, Switzerland is relatively prosperous. Yes, and indeed, let's get some kind of Marshall Plan going on the east-west trade and infrastructure axis that would obviously be important for Ukraine to be the centerpiece of, one of the keystones, right? It should be a bridge between east and west. Well, what does bridge mean? It means get some infrastructure going. And of course, we now see the tragic mistakes of Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. Not only did he transfer Ukraine to transfer the Crimea to Ukraine as a matter of simply administration, but he never built that bridge across the Straits of Kerch, which would have given a second avenue of commerce and communications development corridor into southern Russia, laterally going out of Crimea to the east at the mouth of the Sea of Azov. So that's what we recommend. Now, what could the United States contribute to this? The first thing is to butt out. Let me quote briefly from Putin's landmark speech of Tuesday, the 18th of March, this past week. He says, talks about the destabilization of the former Soviet space and much of the rest of the world. There was a whole series of controlled color revolutions. I think in the original Russian he says orange. Clearly, the people in those nations where these events took place were sick of tyranny and poverty, of their lack of prospects. But these feelings were taken advantage of cynically. Standards were imposed on these nations that did not in any way correspond to their way of life, traditions, or cultures. As a result, instead of democracy and freedom, there was chaos, outbreaks of violence, and a series of upheavals. The Arab Spring turned into the Arab Winter. Well, the big thing that the U.S. could do is to dismantle this lunatic, parasitical apparatus of the color revolutions. And it would mean defunding some parasitical and completely counterproductive agencies, right? The kind of meddling that can start a world war and drag the U.S. into a world war is the stock in trade of the National Endowment for Democracy. They should end, should be abolished. Cut the funding, wipe them out. No more money, not one penny, for the National Endowment for Democracy and the National Democratic Institute, right? The two, and then the Republican Institute, right? It's a creature of the rotten two-party system. So it takes the bankruptcy and failure and incompetence of the U.S. Republican Democratic Wall Street-based party system and tries to project that out into the world. And as I had occasion to write already 30 years ago now, how ironic that they call themselves Project Democracy when what they do is export fascism, because that's what they do. And their policies, their methods are based really on Mussolini's March on Rome and other similar events, right? They've learned from the Kapp Putsch and all the rest of it. So defund the National Endowment for Democracy, defund the parts of the U.S. Agency for International Development that have anything to do with civil society, democratic expression, political parties. Defund all of that. Defund Freedom House, this neocon agency, right? The old Leo Chern networks there in New York City. Defund the Albert Einstein Institute. Defund Gene Sharp. Defund all of these meddlers who get the United States into trouble. And how much will you save? Well, Victoria Nuland, the foul-mouthed representative of the State Department, how can we call her a diplomat with that kind of language? I think not. Nuland said the United States has spent $5 billion, I think I misquoted her in the previous week, It's not 5 million, it's 5 billion with a B, $5,000 million on the democratic development of Ukraine. In other words, funding a bunch of fascists. And when we look at Russia, we can see the money going to Navalny and Pussy Riot and Limonov, right, the National Bolshevik. And these groups are all racist. They're all characterized by hatred of the Caucasus peoples and what have you. They get their money too, right? So anybody in the post-Soviet space, you can be a Nazi, you can be a Death's Head Totenkopf SS, and as long as you're anti-Putin, you become a democratic force, and you're in line for a grant from the U.S. Embassy. And that's what his embassy tenure there in Moscow was all about. So that's what we need to do. Shut down the NED, shut down Freedom House, insofar as it's dependent on public money. And let's look into the tax implications of somebody like Omidyar, the sugar daddy for Snowden and Greenwald and Poitras and the rest of them. If he's giving all that money to the Maidan fascist operations, then has he really been paying his taxes? And I wonder about that. And isn't he violating somebody's laws with that might get him into some kind of a accountability situation? So there we have it. Now, we also have to thank Putin, I would say, from the U.S. point of view. It is in everybody's interests to humiliate and suppress fascism. And what we learn from the history of Europe between the two world wars is that principiis obsta, right? It's time to nip fascism in the bud. When you're dealing with fascism, strangle it in the cradle. Yes, indeed. Wehret den Anfängen, say the Germans. Same thing, principiis obsta. So it's important for this fascist factory there, the Maidan, to be shut down. And that is the common interest of everybody. Now, remember, from the U.S. point of view, one example that we haven't cited in previous weeks, if you don't like what's been done with the Crimea, you better get ready to abolish the state of West Virginia, because it's exactly the same story. Confederacy, Virginia secedes from the Union, West Virginia doesn't want to go into the slave-ocrat yoke in Richmond, and then they say, okay, fine, we're seceding back. We're going to have our own state, rejoin the Union, 1863. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, Webster Tarpley, Washington, D.C. Keep up with everything on Tarpley.net, and a couple of appearances this week. There's a new interview or a debate that I participated in on Press TV the other day. This was principally about Syria. We'll talk about Syria in a minute, but you can check all of that at Tarpley.net, and don't forget to look at those interesting books which I have available in the right-hand column on Tarpley.net. So now, West Virginia, again, West Virginia is exactly the same case. The slave-ocrat state of Virginia seceded from the Union, joined the Confederate States of America, and the mountaineers up in West Virginia said, hell no, we don't want any part of that. They seceded from Virginia and were accordingly admitted to the Union in 1863. What's different? Tell me. So are we going to abolish the state of West Virginia? Maybe Senator Manchin or somebody like this will have something to say about that. But clearly no. And that, I think, is another argument. So Ukraine needs to become a confederal, neutral country on the Swiss model. Now, Yatsenyuk, again, has brought Ukraine under the dictates of the Troika. Let's just handle the question of strategy looking forward here. If Yatsenyuk has approved the Troika and their diktat, right, their association agreement, notice, you don't get to be a full member. You get to be something like one of the third world countries, like somebody in Africa, as was pointed out, right? Some African countries have gotten a better deal than Ukraine under this association agreement, but Yatsenyuk, the puppet, has signed it. And although they're trying to keep it secret, we know what the conditionalities are, right? That the price of gas is going to double, that the price of gasoline is going to go way up, that the social services for the old, the sick, the young, expectant mothers, babies, and so forth, all of that is going to be savagely cut, and so forth. But he's gone ahead and done it. Now, what will Putin do next? If you read Putin's speech, he seems to be saying, what happens to Ukraine from now on depends on whether Kiev will restrain those fascist forces. Because he's saying, if you fascists, you right sector, you Svoboda party, right, you followers of Stepan Bandera, the friend of Hitler, if you dare to come into Kharkov and Donetsk and Lugansk and Dnipropetrovsk and so forth, if you come in there and start killing Russians, then you're going to get rolled over. The steamroller will come and visit you. So don't do it. And Kiev, if you have any brains, you've got to restrain those people if you can. And if you can't, that means we have to restore order. So that is always present. If the ethnic violence escalates, then there will be a Russian military response, and that will lead to the detaching of I would think, everything up to the Dnieper River. Dnieper would make a nice frontier. But the other one is the self-destabilization. Since Yatsenyuk has now gone into this austerity policy by signing the association agreement, he's going to hang himself with killer austerity demands. In other words, he will destabilize his own government. Whoever gets elected president in May, if they then start the IMF shock therapy in May to June, then by the end of the year, they will be ready to be run out of town on a rail. They'll be tarred and feathered and ejected. And that will offer another possibility. And that would, I think, from Putin's point of view, if you keep watching Ukraine, this ruling clique of fascists and IMF puppets sort of mixed up, they're going to discredit themselves. So you better be ready with a political alternative. And this would be not an attack. It would not be some military move that would drive everybody into the hands of Yatsenyuk and Turchinov, but it would be a kind of expulsion of these IMF puppets, because the economy they're going to give the Ukrainian people is much worse than anything they had under Yatsenyuk. So I think that gang is doomed. The problem is, as I see that Stephen Cohen has now joined my position, that Ukraine is the most dangerous real estate in the world because of the two sides, right? The Polish NATO troops and the Russian troops, and both of them able to call on nuclear weapons. So indeed, you could at some point be quite close to a new Cuban missile crisis. So now let's look at some of the other aspects of this. Let's look at Obama, because I think this is one of the most important. What you're going to find with Obama is that this could be much worse. And some people have a hard time with that. But if you look at McCain and if you look at Romney, that's much worse. Or if you look at Senator Murphy of Connecticut, he seems to be much worse. He was over there cavorting with fascists. And if you look at Bernie Sanders talks like a warmonger on this issue, right? He wants to do something. You know, the human rights, the sort of fake left wing of the Democratic Party, the human rights people and all this, they've got their backup, right? They feel that they've got to do something about this. So again, just look at your lineup of hosts on MSNBC, and it's more warmonger than not, or at least no resistance at all to military activity. But now let's look. We had Yatsenyuk at the White House, and we tried, of course, to get a nice demonstration going, and we couldn't get the Answer Coalition to make a call for a demonstration. There were, after that, various demonstrations in New York City and elsewhere with a number of forces. But let's look at what happened when Yatsenyuk was at the White House. I'm basing myself here on some cryptic remarks by Professor Stephen Cohen of NYU, who appeared with Chris Hayes on the All In program on MSNBC this past Tuesday. Right, Tuesday the 28th, I guess it must have been. Sorry, the 18th, Tuesday the 18th of March. And what he said was, Yatsenyuk went into the White House talking crazy, and he came out talking more reasonably. That Yatsenyuk was given a history lesson at the White House. Now, it would be very good to know more about this. I wish Professor Cohen would publish something where he goes through this, but I think he's gotten some kind of a briefing from some kind of an inside source close to the Democratic Party, as I'm sure he is, and with his wife there, Katrina vanden Heuvel, they probably know some interesting things. Please tell us about this. So Yatsenyuk went in talking crazy. He came out talking less crazy, and he was given a history lesson. Now, I think what this seems to mean is something to do with NATO membership for Ukraine. And I think one of the remarkable things was that when Yatsenyuk came out, he did not say anything about Ukraine joining NATO. And this is the thing that the warmongers and the provocateurs always want. Remember, Mad Dog Bush the Younger in 2008 responded to the failure of the Georgian attack on the Russians by saying now it's time for Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova and other countries to join NATO. And this was, again, according to Cohen, vetoed by Merkel. But now Yatsenyuk goes in there and he comes out not saying anything about NATO. I think that may be a hopeful sign. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Ukraine should become a neutral and confederal state. But we're trying to make sense of these cryptic remarks by Professor Stephen Cohen on the Chris Hayes MSNBC show last Tuesday, the 18th of March, same day that Putin made his speech. Yatsenyuk went into the White House talking crazy, came out talking more reasonably, and was given a history lesson while he was there. Now, who in the White House can give anybody a history lesson? It's a very strange remark, but it's possible. And the things that I would go from are, first of all, that when Yatsenyuk came out, there was no talk of NATO expansion. He didn't say anything about NATO expansion. And slightly before this, a couple of days earlier, we have the very interesting report here in the Wall Street Journal. This is by Adam Entous, E-N-T-O-U-S, March 13th. And the headline, U.S. balks at Ukraine military aid requests. U.S. officials wary of inflaming Russia agree only to MREs. In other words, K-rations. They're going to send these food aid. Ukraine's interim government, we read, has appealed for U.S. military aid, including arms, ammunition, and intelligence support, according to senior U.S. officials. But the Obama administration has agreed to send only military rations for now, wary of inflaming tensions with Russia. So the Pentagon is reluctant to be seen as directly supporting Ukraine's beleaguered armed forces during the standoff with Russia. Now, the U.S. And NATO have sent some planes, right? 12 U.S. planes have gone to Poland, and 10 NATO aircraft have gone into the Baltic states. But what happens with the Baltic states is that there's a monthly, I think, or bi-monthly rotation within NATO of extra aid for Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. And whatever the U.S. sends in is apparently going to be withdrawn at the end of next month when the U.S. rotation ends and somebody else takes over, be it the British or Poland or conflicting reports on that. So 12 planes to Poland, 10 planes to Belarus. Some AWACS are flying up and down these borders. Fine. The Russians, for their part, have sent extra Sukhoi fighter planes to Belarus, which is also right in there. Tit for tat, sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander, reciprocity, the great principle of international relations. You put that together then, and then we get to Obama's sanctions list, right? I think he starts off with 11 Russians, and I regret to see on his list people like Rogozin. Dmitry Rogozin had been the Russian envoy to NATO, certainly a man of character, stood up in that very hostile environment for quite a few years during the time of Mad Dog Bush and the neocons. So Rogozin has been hit, and Sergei Glaziev. Sergei Glaziev is really one of the most eminent economists of Russia, and he had to publish his book in English where he could, but still he's written some interesting stuff, and he would count as a nationalist and indeed as a dirigist in terms of economics. So it's unfortunate that some of these people get hit, right? Some of the others one would have less sympathy for. So there is this exchange, and I guess Obama yesterday, Thursday here, said, okay, now I'm going to Florida, and he had this helicopter revving behind him, and he says, now I'm going to issue another dozen or so people that are going to be put under sanctions, and Putin's bank, and so forth, and then off to Florida for a campaign event. It's a highly interesting symbolism, right? That he's essentially going off to Florida, and of course the neocons scream about this, right? William Crystal of the neocons says this is the golden opportunity to sweep aside the war weariness and the disgust with futile foreign wars and reunite everybody around the Ukraine hysteria. Not likely to happen. So I think Obama has figured out that an over engagement in this is bad for Obama, bad for Barkey, BFB, bad for Obama, and therefore not to be done. No mention of NATO expansion, no mention of and the denial apparently of emergency military aid, and then in Obama's appearance in San Diego a couple of days ago, that the military action has been definitely ruled out. Military action taken off the table. And remember, the refrain from Mad Dog Bush was always, everything remains on the table. Don't want to rule it in, don't want to rule it out. It remains on the table. So that could be much worse. With any Republican, it would be much worse. And you can see even little Rand Paul he vacillates according to the audience whether he's going to be saber rattling or trying to fly the flag of the crackpot libertarians. No reliance on him because he would be using the same neocons for his foreign policy. You believe he would be. Remember that Rand made a pilgrimage to William Crystal at the Weekly Standard in order to get himself elected in Kentucky, right, to suppress any raving attacks from the neocons that might have hurt him quite seriously. So, in Europe, there's posturing in public, but generally a great reluctance to go along with serious sanctions. Merkel says that there's a third wave of sanctions, right? The European Union has gone through sanctions on 12 and then sanctions on 21 Russian individuals. Notice that 12 and 21 make 33, so maybe this is a Freemasonic symbol of some kind, but 12 or 33 Russians, this does not influence a great power, and of course everybody mocks them. Rogozin mocks them. Bob Dole says he's proud. Putin says he's going to open an account in the bank where these sanctions have hit. You get the idea. So, for the moment, it would seem that rationality has prevailed. And another very important point, the Ukrainians will not fight. The Ukrainians won't fight. they've had this, according to their analysis, this Crimea has been stolen away from them by military force. Well, what are you going to do about it? And the answer is nothing. So we see these articles in the Washington Post. Oh, the Ukrainians are so resentful that NATO wouldn't do anything for them. Yeah, well, if combat had broken out, this whole thing would look very different. And I say, God forbid. Thank you, Ukrainians, for not being totally crazy. It's hard to get a whole nation of 50 million people to go off the deep end for the likes of Chanibok and Yarosh and Yatsenyuk and Sich. So, but the Ukrainians, they don't fight, right? They won't fight for their borders. They won't fight for their bases. They won't fight for their ships. They won't fight for their headquarters. And that may have many factors. Maybe Obama told Yatsenyuk, look, don't do anything because you'll be on your own. Biden has gone on a blathering tour, shooting his mouth off. Well, as long as it's only his mouth. He went to Poland. He met with Tusk. Tusk, of course, like most Polish demagogues in the school of the Kaczynski twins, mainly bad-mouthing Russia, right? That's their stock in trade. Fine, we know this too. That won't upset anybody's apple cart. Biden also went to Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, or I think he visited 2 out of the 3, and a couple as part of the visit was consolidated. And what everybody noticed was that he offered nothing, and it was simply the visit and some rah-rah rhetoric. I think he said it was a blatant attack. It was a brazen attack. But nothing. And there's no announcement of the ABM systems being ramped up in the way that the neocons want, right? Poland and Czech Republic. So back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. So if the Ukrainian fascist clique will not fight for their own borders, their own bases, their own Navy ships, their own headquarters, then what is the point here? The frustration in Kiev, according to the Washington Post of the 17th of March. The Russians are taking a piece of our country. Where is the West? Europe and the United States have abandoned us. Well, let's talk Turkey here. It is not up to the United States to rescue every group of fascist adventurers who run up against some difficulties. Right? There is no common value here, and if Ukraine wants to be a civilized country, they better get rid of Yarosh, Janibok, Sik, and the rest of them. Everybody from Svoboda and everybody from Pravi Sektor has to go. And if you really want to be human, you better get rid of the Fatherland Party too. That would be Turchinov and Yatsenyuk, the Timoshenko puppets, who are now talking about fascist austerity, something worse than just about any country has ever gotten. We look at the Washington Post here of Wednesday, the day after Putin's speech. Putin signs treaty making Crimea a part of Russia. So here we get treated to a quote from this Pirubi. And remember, Pirubi is a Nazi. Pirubi is the founder of the National Socialist Party, or Social National Party, which is the predecessor of Svoboda, and this is the Stefan Bandera Nazi collaborationist party. Collaborationism. The collabo. That's who's now in power. And as we read that article, we also find the head of the Ukrainian general staff is complaining that he can't get into Ukraine. That's the guy who blockaded Russian ships illegally in the harbor of Sevastopol, violating a treaty. In doing so, during the attack on Georgia, he wanted to do his part. And of course, when the referendum was carried out, we have Yatsenyuk saying it's a circus. A circus. Well, it looked like a pretty orderly kind of vote that went on there in the Crimea, and maybe Yatsenyuk is trying to tell us that he prefers the way that he took power, right? Not by voting, not by any kind of process of a referendum or a plebiscite, but in the case of Yatsenyuk, it was a grand guignol of fascist hoodlums and thugs known as the Maidan. That's who Yatsenyuk represents, or actually he doesn't even represent them. He has duped them so that they put themselves under the control of the International Monetary Fund. So have no illusions, and I think it's time to roll this stuff back. Not a circus. That was a normal referendum. Let's just get some insights into Putin's landmark speech here. Now, this is a 45-minute speech. I urge everybody to watch this, read this. There are some differences in the translation. I could point out some of them, but probably not good to waste some time on this. And I think I mentioned one translation says orange when it's color revolutions. That's not so material. In another one, some of the translations are toned down. He says the gunmen of Maidan, not the militant. So in one translation, you read militant, and I think Putin is saying something more like gunmen. So this is the landmark speech on the 18th of March in the Great Hall there of the Kremlin, and he's got the entire Duma, Federation Council, regions, and civil society, all kinds of people. So the historical links are clear. We've mentioned them. It is a part of Russia. The Bolsheviks and Khrushchev transferred it. This was a wrong decision. They were simply transferred. They were never consulted, but that didn't seem to be so important. But then when the USSR fell apart, it became important. And, of course, the base of the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, going back to Peter the Great. And then in 1991, this goes back to the breakup of the Soviet Union, residents of the Crimea were handed over like a sack of potatoes. They went to bed as citizens of one country and woke up as a minority in a totally different country, and this is many millions. So Putin then stresses that when he had to negotiate with Kuchma of Ukraine in the early aughties, he tried to be as generous as he could because he was interested in good relations with the new independent Ukraine. But then Ukraine evolved under NATO control, right, with Timoshenko and Yushchenko, NATO agents. He evolved towards a failed state, and he goes on to say there, I can understand why the Ukrainians wanted change. The authorities in power were not capable. They went to other people, had to emigrate, go overseas, become day laborers. They did not go to the Silicon Valley, but they became day laborers. Now, that's a dig at Medvedev and Medvedev's gaga, starry-eyed trip to Silicon Valley a couple of years ago. So 3 million people had to emigrate. And then the foreign control was very great. He points out that as soon as this new clique took over, they tried to ban the use of Russian, and they were warned by their foreign controllers that they had to take that back. But still, that law is still available, sitting in a drawer somewhere. But these people are the heirs of Bandera, Hitler's accomplice during World War II, and he goes on to say they have resorted to murder, terror, riots, nationalist in Russian means something more like a racist than it does in English. Nationalists, neo-Nazis, Russophobes, anti-Semites, and they have the domination of Ukraine at this point. So he had to could not abandon Crimea. That would have been a betrayal, and as I would add, it also would have been a civil war from the bottom up, a grassroots civil war, much harder to stop. They have respected, says Putin. The limit in the treaty is 25,000. They did not exceed that. Of course, they did go off the bases, but there we go. And then he says, we're told that we violated international law. What have we violated? There is the Kosovo precedent, and the Kosovo precedent has been approved by the World Court of the United Nations, The Hague, and the United States note of April 17, 2009. Declarations of independence may and often do violate domestic legislation, but this does not make them violations of international law. So Kosovo Albanians can secede, but not Ukrainians, Russians, and Tatars in Crimea. So it's not a special case. It's identical. There is no difference. I would take a look at West Virginia if you want something closer to home. And then he says the situation in Ukraine reflects what has been happening in the world over the past 20 years. United States, not guided by international law, but by the rule of the gun, they believe in their exclusivity and exceptionalism, that they can decide the destinies of the world. Only they can be right, and act as they please, use force where they want to. If you're not with us, you're against us, makes aggression look legitimate. He said he was stunned, as all of us were. 1999, Belgrade bombed by NATO at the eve of the 21st century. Then the U.S. hit Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and distorted the resolution on Libya. So some aspects. We'll do another segment on Putin's speech in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley just reviewing this speech by Putin in the Kremlin this past Tuesday, the 18th of March. Now remember, this process is now finished. As of today, Friday, the 21st of March, it's all signed, sealed, delivered. Ukraine is now officially, irrevocably a part of the Russian Federation. Actually, Crimea is in it, and the city of Sevastopol is in it as a separate entity, which is traditionally the status that it had. So Putin's Philippic, his indictment against the NATO policies, and we've just mentioned Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Libyan resolution violated. Then the color revolutions, we've already heard this part. The Arab Spring became the Arab Winter. And in Ukraine in 2004, there was a third round of presidential voting, violation of the Constitution imposed by an organized and well-equipped army of militants. And he may be saying gunmen in that case, too, already. So Russia has sought dialogue. The West, NATO, says this is none of your business. This does not concern you. Concerning visa issues, fair competition, free access to global markets, always delayed, and the technology embargo. This is very interesting. He cites by name the old COCOM, Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls list. Technologies on the COCOM list could not be sent into the bloc and to Russia. He says, formally speaking, this is no longer there, but in practice, it's still there. There's still a technological embargo. But with Ukraine, our Western partners have crossed the line, playing the bear and acting irresponsibly and unprofessionally. Quite right. And he also says this is continues the infamous policy of containment of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, which continue. And, of course, in the 18th and 19th, it's really the British who do this, and midway through the 20th, the U.S. under the infamous pro-Nazi George Kennan. And then this is the international context, right? So we're grateful to China because they've understood our position, and we appreciate India's reserve and objectivity. Now, here's something you haven't heard. Today, says Putin, I would like to address the people of the United States of America, the people who, since the foundation of their nation and adoption of the Declaration of Independence, have been proud to hold freedom above all else. Isn't the desire of Crimea's residents to freely choose their fate such a value? Please understand us. I think it's understandable. Then he appeals to Germany and to Europe, but Germany, first of all, we helped you get reunited. We wanted to be reunited with Ukraine. Addressed to the people of Ukraine, don't believe the people who tell you that we're going to conquer the rest of your country. Don't be afraid of that, but it will be a home to all peoples there, but it will not be a Bandera country, a Nazi state. So he also says, look, if NATO takes over Ukraine, the Crimea, then the Crimea will be lost to both Russians and Ukrainians. Suppose Kiev joins NATO. That would mean the NATO Navy would be in Sevastopol, in the Black Sea. And he says, it's a military alliance. I can't imagine that we would go to Sevastopol and visit NATO sailors. Most of them are wonderful guys, but it would be better to have and let them come and visit us and be our guests rather than the other way around. Kiev is the mother of Russian cities. Please understand our concerns. Friendship with Ukraine. So they're now including Sevastopol gets the special sanctions status. The opposition. He says, inside Russia there's an opposition. We have to defend our national interests. Western politicians are threatening us not just with sanctions, but also with the prospect of increasingly serious problems on the domestic front. In other words, color revolution. I would like to know who it is they have in mind exactly. Action by a fifth column, this disparate bunch of national traitors. National traitors would be Navalny, Kasparov, Limonov. Or are they hoping to put us in worsening social and economic situation to provoke public discontent? These statements are irresponsible and aggressive in tone, and we will respond to them accordingly. This was a fair referendum. Now we're going to have to vote on this, and he appeals then for the vote, and it's gone through by practically, I think it was almost unanimous the first time, and now today it became completely unanimous. Couple of things. If you think that Putin is too harsh, I will tell you this is the wages of two or three things. It's the wages of meddling. It's the wages of the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, Gene Sharp, the Albert Einstein Institute, people who are threatening you. You want to know where happy old Gene Sharp is going to get you? Go and look online. You can see the whole The Day After, okay, with Jason Robards from the Reagan war scares. And what it shows you is how inconvenient it is to have your city hit with an H-bomb. And it takes place out there in Kansas. So take a look. You can see that Putin has been formed by this spectacle of NATO that had never bombed anybody, bombing Serbia, all over these trumped-up stories spread by Amanpour of 100,000 dead Albanians or Kosovars, which were complete frauds. And you can also see that 1999, that Putin came into power as a kind of a hardline reaction against the rape of Serbia. And you're paying the price of Medvedev. This is what I would say also to Putin, right? That the one point you cite about the Libyan resolution, Medvedev. And Medvedev, I think when Putin says the national traitors, he means these scurrilous guys, the Navalnys. But how about the oligarchs in general? How about the people who support Medvedev, the Medvedev faction? You can see, again, through that dig at Medvedev and Silicon Valley, right? And he could have gone on to say the Hamburger Summit. And what happened after the Hamburger Summit? Within a couple of days, we had the red-haired Russian Mata Hari there, Anna Chapman, I guess, discovered by the FBI. That Hamburger Summit was in some ways the first normal, non-Cold War, non-confrontational summit of the U.S. and Russia, and the faction in the CIA didn't want it to work. But it was Medvedev who allowed the Libyan resolution to go through. Medvedev, who is a great admirer of Deep Purple and who brought his son to see Deep Purple and represents this kind of degradation. I'm sorry. So there is a certain responsibility in that corner. But generally speaking, Putin is exactly right. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. People who are making up your calendar now for the springtime, there will be the Left Forum in New York City, May 30th, June 1st. And it looks like I may be attending. We'll look into this, but save the date, and we'll let you know more about that in the near future. Putin's speech. One thing that Russia ought to do right away, and this is part of liquidating the heritage of Medvedev. You can't roll back the Libyan events, right? Remember, Ambassador Chamov of the Russian Federation said, Medvedev, you're a traitor. And Mr. Shevchenko, Comrade Shevchenko there of the Russian media, is somebody who also went on the radio and said the same thing. It's time for Russia to exit the sanctions regime on Iran. And I remember I still was invited from time to time to Russia Today back in the spring of 2010, and it must have been April 1st, and they told me, guess what? Russia has just joined the West in sanctions against Russia, and my response was, this must be an April Fool joke. But it was true. Medvedev made it possible. Maybe he'd been listening to Deep Purple. And as a matter of fact, when Medvedev cavorted with Deep Purple, these British degenerate musicians, this was right as the bombing of Libya started. So you can see Medvedev sitting in Moscow listening to Deep Purple while the jets were in the skies over Libya. You get the idea. So thank God for Putin. I think of the alternatives also in that area. But one obvious thing to do is to end the Iran sanctions regime. Just break it up. If Russia exits, then it's all over. And I think similarly, you're going to see a hardening of the Russian line on Syria, which I hope we can get to now in our final segment. The Washington Post of today, Anne Applebaum, right? She's nothing but the wife of the Polish foreign minister Sikorski, and she's got her contribution today. Russia unveiled. And she wants to have a policy of economic warfare. We got to move NATO forces from Germany to the alliance's eastern border. We've got to go after the Russians through tax shelters, money laundering, and change the energy policy. And in this article, she often tells you that she's the wife of the provocative anti-Russian incendiary Sikorsky, but there she is. So you get the idea. It's also interesting. Some Russian deputies have talked about expropriating Western property in Russia if they go too far with the sanctions. What could come out of this, and one scenario, is the end of globalization. In other words, if the national states reassert themselves in the way that we're seeing with Russia, they could do things like say all Western derivatives are banned and then refuse to pay them. And they've just been given a nudge, right? 2 of the 3 principal ratings agencies have now downgraded the outlook on Russian debt. Well, that's just fine. Learn to live with that. Why not look into the tax returns and other possible criminal activity of the officials of some of those credit ratings agencies and see if it's not possible to put an end to their provocations through some legal means. And all of that is stuff that can go in the right direction. And don't invite Deep Purple to your dacha so that they can begin poisoning the mind of your son. Brzezinski is trying to push the idea this morning on Morning Joe with his daughter Mika that Putin is some kind of a mystic, that he's an eccentric or a narcissist, and he talks about some not better identified teacher of Putin. And what can this be? There are two people. One is his Putin's teacher Vera Gurevich in the St. Petersburg area has published some reminiscences. There's nothing strange in there. And then we have Tikhon Shevkunov, his confessor, right, his duchovnik, directeur de conscience of Putin. But I don't detect any element of mysticism of any kind, or irrationality or irrationalism of any kind in this speech. This is more substantive than Obama. Putin can afford to be much more substantive than Obama. It's all fact-based, as Stephen Cohen confessed. It's all fact-based, and it's a compelling argument. Even the Washington Post has some guy today confessing, well, Putin actually has a case, although we don't agree with a lot of it. But he's got some things on his side, right? A grudging kind of admission. And in reality, Putin is more fact-based than these policies in the West. We're getting the background now. Truth Dig. Take a look at Truth Dig. Truth Dig has the story about how Abby Martin was brought in. Or I'm sorry, not so much Abby Martin, but Liz Wall. And this was done by some neocons, we're told. A bunch of neocons, and they're people who have they've been trying to gin up military conflicts. Take a look at Truth Dig. I won't go through the names because these people are not well known, but you get the idea. I would also, if you want to see the intellectual bankruptcy of Abby Martin, I can point you to a really imbecilic interview where Abby Martin interviews Jesse Ventura about tax policy, and Jesse says that he's for the national sales tax, and she thinks that's a great idea. This is awful. The whole point of a sales tax is if you have to make purchases, you pay tax on that. So it means that with the national sales tax, the tax burden is shifted to the lower incomes, because the poor people have to spend all their income on food, clothing, shelter, whereas the rich parasites and predators spend a very small percentage of what they take in and use the rest to buy derivatives. And as we know, up to now, unless and until we implement the urgent 1% Wall Street sales tax on stocks, bonds, and derivatives, on derivative purchases right now, you don't pay any tax. So Abby Martin thinks it's groovy and dreamy for Jesse Ventura to say, let's have the national sales tax. And this is a level of imbecility that I have seldom seen. But now, let's shift our view to Syria. Preface this with the Washington Post headline of the first week in March that Assad is taking advantage, that he feels now that with Russia under attack, more or less, with color revolutions and sanctions and destabilizations, that Russia is going to have to stick with its friends no matter what, and Syria is clearly one of those. So the bond between Syria and Russia is not going to be broken by Western action. And therefore, he's getting ready to have an election later this year and get himself reelected. Well, civil wars, right? Judging from the American one of 150 years ago, civil wars can sometimes go on for about 4 years. That's the model here. We've just passed the 3-year mark. So is there a perspective that Assad can mop up the terrorist rebels within the next 12 months? Yes. City of Yabrud on the Lebanese border has fallen. And this morning, the castle, Le Krach des Chevaliers, the Crusader Castle, has also been liberated from the terrorist gang. Back in a minute with more on this World Crisis Radio. Welcome back. It's the final segment of this edition of World Crisis Radio, coming to you from Washington on the 21st of March. We don't have time for domestic today, but the the analysis I gave about Sink in Florida getting beaten by a reactionary Republican is there's a pale echo of that with Eugene Robinson on the Washington Post of March 18th. Go bold or go home, and that's for Sink. How could you get yourself defeated, Sink? Well, by being weak and equivocal on Obamacare and other issues. And by the way, the Obamacare deadline is coming up, so let me join my voice to people who say, if you don't have health insurance, you should sign up and get it. Get that subsidy. That's your economic right. Get a subsidy. Get, if you can find a decent policy there, get it. And if you're young, you're going to have sports injuries. You're going to fall off a motorcycle. You're going to OD on your recreational substances there. And all of those things will land you in the emergency room. And it's not free. There is a law, much hated by Governor Deal of Georgia, which says the hospital has to treat you, but they'll also send you a bill, and your credit will be ruined for the rest of your life. So why not sign up for Obamacare, which apparently you can't do after March 31st. There's an open season every year. I think that's crazy. You should be able to sign up for this any time, but fact is you can't. Anyway, Syria. Yabrud, key supply line coming in from Lebanon, from the various anti-Syrian NATO puppets there in Lebanon, the Hariri faction. That's been captured, and Le Crac des Chevaliers, which is this matchless reconnaissance tower that allows you to see over large parts of this border area. Acting out of military weakness, the U.S. has closed the Syrian embassy and the Syrian consulates. It's the new guy, I think his name is Rubinstein, has replaced the death squad expert Ford. So he shut down the consulates. This is a pathetic, impotent gesture of rage and frustration. And the Israelis are back in the mix, bombing the Syrian army. But I think these are two contemptible efforts, right? They're impotent and odious. The U.S. closes the consulates. The Israelis do the bombing. Now, what's actually going on? I lean to some extent on this guy Joshua Landis out in Oklahoma who follows the stuff. Notice that there's this clash between Saudis and Qatar. Qatar wants the Al Jazeera shut down. But according to Landis, the Saudis are in the process of dumping many of the most radical terrorist groups operating in Syria, and some of those are going back to Europe or the United States. That can spell terrorism here, but they are leaving Syria, hopefully didn't get sophisticated weapons. And Landis stresses that the terrorist rebels are divided and anti-American, and therefore it's still impossible to get at least to Congress to vote for it, although the CIA may be doing it behind their back. So the Saudis splitting from Qatar, the Saudis much disaffected, apparently the government is dumping some of the radical groups, but Saudi individuals continue to send money. Turkey is getting cold feet. They're not available as a automatic avenue of logistical support for these terrorist rebels. And I would also point to this fact: if it's true that Doku Umarov, the leader of the Chechens, the terrorists, if he's been killed, then that indicates a severe disruption of the Chechen network that was backing up the Syrian terrorists. And we were told by a couple of sources that the Chechens were the most effective of all fighters. They were the craziest, they were the most aggressive, the most bloodthirsty. So the ISIS, the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and Sham, has been expelled by the Nusra Front, and I think also by the Islamic Front, from some key areas that they were holding. They've been driven back to Raqqa in the far northeast of the country. And, well, if it's a civil war, it's not uncommon for civil wars to have no political solution, but only a military one. The American Civil War ended with military solutions when Lee surrendered to Grant and when Joe Johnston surrendered to Sherman. That's when it ended. And similarly, the Russian Civil War also, when Wrangel, Denikin, Kolchak, and the rest of them, when they were defeated, and when the Entente powers could no longer maintain their invading armies because of mass strike upheavals back in their own countries, that's when the resistance to the Bolsheviks collapsed, and they won the Civil War. So I think that it may be possible to hope that the city of Aleppo will be liberated during this campaigning season, and that will be the prelude to large parts of Syria being freed from the terrorist presence. Now, a couple of things in conclusion. One of the problems of Ukraine is certainly that they lack experience of self-government. Now, I went back and looked. The origin of the modern Ukrainian state is that they are the spawn of the German General Staff of World War I. That is, Field Marshal Hindenburg and Field Marshal Ludendorff created Ukraine, and they created it. They conquered this area in 1917, and then in February of 1918, there was this peace. It's known as the Brotfrieden, the bread peace of February 1918 between Austria-Hungary and the German Empire on the one side, Russia on the other, which essentially said Ukraine has to become an independent country. You've got to recognize that it's essentially Eastern Galicia, right, Galicia, and in exchange for allowing Ukraine to come into existence, the Germans get food. They get grain, bread, to break the Allied sea blockade. Now, this came out of a kind of negotiation where the Russian delegate was Trotsky, and then the Germans, they had other conditions to impose, and Trotsky wouldn't sign. So he blew up the negotiations. He said he was hoping it was springtime 1918, and he was hoping for the world revolution, which he wouldn't have to make concessions to the German General Staff. But that didn't happen, so that in March of 1918, he had to go back and sign the Peace of Brest-Litovsk. And Brest-Litovsk, this peace arrangement that took Russia finally out of World War I, this created the independent Ukraine. So when you think about Ukraine, they have this regard for Germany, or they should, based on the fact that it was thanks to these German militarists that Ukraine came into existence. But now, if we think about the fact that other than those few years, right, 1918, 19, and maybe 1920, although not even, Ukraine has got about 25 years of self-government experience in the last 1,000 years. And boy, do they show it, right? They have no idea of compromise, no idea of elections or anything of the sort. And this is compared, I've been meaning to read you this, I don't think we'll even get through it this time, but William L. Shirer, Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, points to the fact that Poland had this problem, right? And he writes about Poland, deprived of their political freedom for a century and a half, and thus without modern experience in self-rule, the Poles were unable to establish stable government or begin to solve their economic and agrarian problems. And they also had a pro-German foreign policy. Some people concluded that Poland was driven by some fateful flaw in their national character towards self-destruction, and that they were sometimes their own worst enemies. I would recommend this. You can change that to Ukraine and apply it a fortiori. And I would also urge that you apply that to somebody like Sikorsky, the Kaczynski twins, or Anne Applebaum, right? That Poland is doing better these days, but Ukraine shows these problems in a very, very acute form. So come back next week to World Crisis Radio.